Hi, everyone. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is a live virtual tasting on the fresh and very lively Sauvignon Blancs of Villa Maria, one of New Zealand's premier wineries and one of the wineries that pioneered Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand. So thank you for being here. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. And if you've been here before, we're so glad you're back. As always, we'll take your questions and you're welcome to chat throughout. Before I introduce my guest, let me start with a couple of facts about New Zealand and about Sauvignon Blanc there. First is that the country is about midway, exactly midway between the South Pole and the equator. Its nearest land mass, Australia, is not quite next door, as many people think. It's about 1,000 miles away. And New Zealand's wineries are the first each day to see the sun, thanks to the country's position close to the international dateline. So in the mid-1990s, New Zealand had about 30 wineries. Today it has over 700 wineries. And among all the grapes that it grows, those two that we know so well and that are so associated with the country are Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir. But Sauvignon Blanc in particular holds a very special place in the New Zealand hierarchy, since 71% of all the wine produced in New Zealand is Sauvignon Blanc. So lastly, again, Helen, hold on, we are going to introduce you, but let me just quickly put up a map because all of our viewers just love to see a map kind of before we launch in. I want everybody to see how New Zealand is completely surrounded by water and the positioning of the two islands, the North Island and the South Island, relative to each other. So with that, and now let me introduce Helen Morrison. Helen Morrison, welcome. Helen is the winemaker for Villa Maria. We're so glad to be talking with you, and you're coming to us right from the cellar in New Zealand.
Exactly. So pleased to be with you guys and helping celebrate that International Sauvignon Blanc Day.
That's right. That's right. You know, Helen, we're going to talk about your three specific Sauvignon Blancs in a minute, and also the history of Villa Maria. But first, I'd like to talk about flavor. I remember, and I think most people do, most wine drinkers remember the first time they ever tasted a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, because it was like, oh my God, wow, what an out-of-body intense experience, right? I mean, I remember thinking, I was just so startled. I remember thinking, it can't possibly, nothing tastes this vivid and this intense. What is it that makes New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc so dramatic?
Yeah, well, that's an amazing starting point, because it is really that flavor explosion that you're mentioning that effectively put Sauvignon Blanc on the map for New Zealand and made people kind of stand up and just really have a close look at, you know, where is this country in the world, and how is it that these wines are so expressive and so different to Sauvignon Blancs from other parts of the world. And so I think, I mean, so much of it must come down to, as you were discussing when you were showing that map, the proximity to the coastline in New Zealand, and especially the influence that has on our weather and our four seasons here. So really so much of what we're talking about through that growing season is that weather, that influence, what impact that has on the growing season, the vineyards, the vines, and ultimately those final Sauvignon Blanc wines. And so I guess really that journey that New Zealand's been on since those first famous Sauvignon Blancs got recognised kind of back in the late 80s, it is now, is, well, what actually drives that flavour profile? What is that perfect balance of spicy green notes but ripe tropical notes, and really how do we keep delivering that flavour profile that everyone's come to know and love to the world year on year, but at the same time, how do we show the fact that we can evolve that market and produce Sauvignon Blancs of different styles and different textures as well?
Yes, which we'll get to in a minute, because you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that is um, perhaps a little unfortunate here in the US is that we think of Sauvignon Blanc, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, as one thing. And of course, it isn't one thing. Not only are there many different producers, but even a producer such as yourself has many different Sauvignon Blancs, and we're going to be tasting 3 of them in a minute. Before we do that, though, let's talk about Villa Maria and its history for a minute, because I was reading the other day that Villa Maria began in the 1960s with a like a 5-acre plot of land, very, very small, very humble. Today it produces 2.5 million cases. That is a success story that is just astounding. Give us a quick snapshot of the history of Villa Maria.
Yeah, so as you alluded to, it really did start from that tiny kind of postage stamp size parcel of land, and like an incredibly determined founder. So he was literally going against his parents' wishes by setting up that vineyard. So in the Croatian background that Sir George Fistonich had, the second son should be doing a trade. And so to him to want to push out in his own direction and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit to set up a vineyard was very much kind of going against what they'd wanted for him. But he really wanted to prove to himself and to his parents, but also to New Zealand, that it was a country that would be capable of growing and producing great quality wines. And so it was really, I guess, his drive through those early years of that business that really pushed the industry to be looking at what grape varieties they were growing in what regions and really what did wine quality look like. So in that early stage of the 60s and the 70s, the New Zealand wine industry from a consumer perspective was very limited knowledge. There was no understanding of what a grape varietal name like Sauvignon Blanc even was. And so really he was so instrumental in kind of driving the industry to the level of recognition that it's at today. And that journey for us in Marlborough started in the 1990s. So,
well, what you're saying, Helen, is reminding me that in the 60s when Villa Maria began, but the 60s and 70s, New Zealand had almost no export market. It was trying to sell all of the wine that it made, that small amount, but still in a country with a very small population. I was actually reading an excerpt from my own wine Bible, the next edition. But for some crazy reason, one day I looked up this statistic of how many sheep are there to people in New Zealand. It's the kind of thing you do when you get writer's block. You look up something for fun. And today it's 5-1 sheep to people. But back in the 60s, it was 25-1. So the population was a very small population. So here you were, or here he was, not only doing something quite radical, and as you say, against his parents' wishes, but also without the assurance that there would even be a market for the wine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that, as I say, such entrepreneurial spirit and such kind of belief that really the land that he'd seen would be capable of such great things. So, and really used that kind of vision as he expanded into the Hawke's Bay region in the North Island, and then down into Marlborough into the 1990s. Right. And even then, that spirit of adventure and planting different varieties and different sub-regions still pushed on. So Villa Maria was one of the first wine companies to be planting in that cooler Awatere Valley within Marlborough. So it's something I guess we try and keep in the forefront of our minds kind of as we're crafting wines that are on his behalf these days.
Wow. Well, let's dive right in and start tasting. We're going to start with your private bin. This is a wine that so many of us in America know because, I'll just hold it up to the camera here for a second, because it is well known. It is your most popular wine. It's also an incredible steal at about, $16 or $17 in the US. And I guess because you make several Sauvignon Blancs, I want to start with, what was the goal of this one? Your most popular wine, your most popular Sauvignon Blanc. What was the flavor goal? What were you trying to do with this wine?
Yeah, so with that private burn Sauvignon, as you've mentioned, it's really that one wine that most customers would have tried from us and then recognize from all over the world. So, that pressure is there to be delivering what customers are wanting year on year. And really for us, this wine is about a little bit of everything that Marlborough could deliver. So in this Wairau Valley, so that's the warmer sub-region within Marlborough, that's where you're going to get more of those kind of tropical fruit flavors, hints of that citrus and grapefruit, and softer, richer palate profile. And then we're balancing that with that Awatere Valley. So that's a little bit more southern part of Marlborough. It's more influenced by the wind. And so there you're getting more of those kind of classic green, freshly picked herbs, crunchy kind of lemongrass, even a bit of that spicy jalapeno kind of note. So really what we're delivering in private bin should be a little bit of all of those flavor profiles, but in a way that come together really well rather than clash against each other.
I want to talk about the concept of green for a minute, because I think and I'm just looking if I put something here in my file, I may not have, but one of the things that we know about Sauvignon Blanc is that it can have this very green flavor, but I'll distinguish between, and I'm sure you would as well, kind of good greens, like keeping on the good side of green, and then the vegetative bad side. So when we talk about green glowingly, happily in the wine business, we're not talking about cabbage water or asparagus water or boiled green beans or any of those things, but all these really interesting good greens. And you just mentioned lemongrass, for example. How do you stay on the good side of green? How do you make sure that there are all these fresh herbs and maybe snow peas and beautiful lettuces and good greens as opposed to a more vegetative green?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's even a slightly earlier green in there as well, which is that unripe green. So that, green malic, fresh apple, just being mindful that you've got enough ripeness as well to get beyond that particular flavor profile. And I guess really looking for, as you say, those good greens, I think it comes down to ripeness. It comes down to the site expression. And then it would come down to just actually how are you blending those different parcels together. So as you're alluding to, sometimes some of that perhaps more cabbage, asparagus, green bean characteristic can be just kind of too many green parcels kind of blended together, pushes a blend and pushes that aromatic down that sort of path. Sometimes it can be age or oxidative handling in the winery, pushing a wine kind of in that direction. Unfortunately, these days, shipping and storage of a wine sat in a hot place for too long a period of time, it's going to push a wine in that direction of green bean and asparagus as well. And so really, I guess we're being very mindful to be thinking, okay, what is it about that wine that keeps it fresh and keeps it bright? And certainly that's where that cooler climate that we have here in Marlborough and having that lovely line of acidity will help keep those wines fresh and help keep that flavour spectrum in a good green place, as you called it.
Yeah, and I wonder if, in fact, just thinking about this now, I can see how growing Sauvignon Blanc from very cool near the coast vineyards to perhaps farther inland near the mountains, a little bit warmer. I can see how tropical flavors, which are also equally present in so many of yours and all the top New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs, I can see how those tropical flavors would balance out that little bit of fresh, good green, as you call it. Are those tropical flavors, my question is going to be, are those tropical flavors simply an issue of ripeness?
So it'll be a matter of ripeness for sure, but then also a little bit of, I guess, that vineyard management perspective. So what kind of exposure to sunlight have those bunches had? How much leaf was removed through that growing season? So often that exposure to light will help lessen the impact of those green flavours. And then it will become quite site specific as well. So we're often seeing more of a tropical spectrum coming from vineyards where it's got more of a clay soil and perhaps a little bit of an aspect as well. So a little bit of that sloping towards the north or towards the west. So again, that's all just sort of emphasising riper spectrum rather than big, shadier, bigger canopy is going to promote perhaps more of those ripe green characteristics.
Yeah. So important to have that sense of balance and dynamism and tension between these two diametrically opposed but very harmonious at the same time flavors. Well, this private bin is so, to me, I always describe it as kind of tangy. It's very alive. There's an enormous amount of energy in this wine, and as you say, freshness, beautiful balance. Why would you not blend in? A lot of Sauvignon Blanc producers around the world blend in a small amount of something else. Semillon, maybe a different Sauvignon Gris, for example. There are some Sauvignon Blanc producers in the US who blend in a tiny bit of Viognier, but your wines are always 100% Sauvignon Blanc. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think we at Villa Moria have an amazing array of different vineyard sites in those different sub-regions within Marlborough. And as you were mentioning before, there are literally vineyards that are right down at the coast. There are vineyards that are tucked up on those kind of clay hillsides that I was mentioning, and there's a lot of vineyards that are on that perhaps more stony river gravel soils. And so I guess we're seeing such a complexity of flavour profiles, different levels of acidity, even down to different kind of thicknesses and grape skins from across each of those different vineyard sites. And then you add into the mix the diversity we have now with different vineyard ages, different trellisings, different management systems. So in a way, you've got so much complexity from all of those different plantings of Sauvignon that we're pretty confident we're delivering a wine that has that little bit of spice or a little bit of extra aromatic just from that array of choices. And ultimately, I guess in the examples that you were using, really what that winemaker is looking for, if they're adding in that little bit of Semillon or that little bit of Viognier, is just that little bit of extra spice. It's kind of like the seasoning after you've just cooked a meal. And so I think we can see that we have the option to do that with the Sauvignon Blanc choices that we have here.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'm thinking that about this wine's freshness for a moment too, and just focusing on that. It reminds me a little bit. You'll forgive this this metaphor, but it reminds me a bit of like a margarita without the tequila. So you've got that fresh squeezed lime. And then a little bit of salinity, like as a margarita, you might have salt on the edge, right? A little bit of salinity, or some might call it minerality, that perhaps does come from more coastally positioned vineyards.
Yeah, no, I totally forgive you for a start, because I've used that in tasting notes, perhaps not ones that make it to the back label, but describing to myself that tequila and lime, and as you say, that kick kind of from the salt. And so yes, that's definitely a characteristic that we'll see in those really coastal vineyards. So so much of the weather influence here can be those winds coming in from the coast, and that can really, I guess, impact that growing season. So it'll really elongate that last kind of part of summer, and as we moved into fall, just kind of really puts the cap on those temperatures, and that wind run really affects those vines as well. So they're kind of having to work that kind of bit harder just to get that last kind of step of ripeness. And so from that process and that proximity to the close coast, you'll get that, literally, as you say, mineral salinity. You're thinking kind of freshly shucked oysters, that sort of flavour profile. And so that, with the fact that it's a very cool climate, you're getting that kind of greener, spicy kind of note coming in as well. So definitely a flavour profile that not everybody loves. So if you're using it in a blend, you need to be mindful that it's kind of balanced. But yeah, definitely adds to that, as you say, energy of that wine.
Totally. All right. Well, let's go to, I want to talk now about your EarthGarden Sauvignon Blanc. Let me hold this up. Here it is. And this is a great name. I'm surprised it hadn't been used before. EarthGarden Sauvignon Blanc. This is also from Marlborough. Both of these two wines that we've had first are from Marlborough on the north end of the South Island. So this is a wine that is organic, I understand. Maybe we should start out by saying, though, that New Zealand in general has a very strong commitment to sustainability. I think I read in Decanter magazine the other day that 96% of all the wineries in New Zealand now belong to your sustainability program, the countrywide sustainability program. So tell us a little bit about this wine and why you made it a separate wine.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, in New Zealand, it has always been a real key focus is that sustainability piece, and definitely one of the first countries that set up within the wine industry that set of key goals that we're looking to achieve to be able to get that sustainability recognition. But I guess within the Villa Maria family, we were really thinking about, okay, it's family owned, and it's really becomes about that drive to be looking after the land for future kind of generations. What is that impact that we're having? How are we minimizing that impact? And so the idea came about to have that that message, that story sort of delivered in a bottle and in a brand. And so as part of that sustainability journey, it also becomes about, well, how are we continually improving? So it's not just about that kind of benchmark, what's the bare minimum to achieve that status, what else can we be doing? So, and I guess that just really encompassed those sort of goals of, well, how are we looking after the land, or really that comes back to what are those alternative methods that are out there? How do we look at biodiversity and using natural ways to be mitigating pests and disease? How do we look at natural alternatives to synthetic sprays? So how do we naturally get that vineyard nutrition and balance? And how do we minimise the number of tractor passes that we might be doing in the vineyards so we're avoiding soil compaction? And then really diving into the science of, well, actually, how do we measure the water that's in the soil and how much water the vine actually needs, rather than just turning on the tap to irrigate it every day because that's what we've always done. So I guess starting to use those tools and technology as they become available to be really honing in on, well, what are those alternative things that we can be doing that will have a long lasting impact. And then that stepped on from there into that whole equation of, well, how much impact is the type of glass that we're using for the final package, and how do we make sure we're using recycled packaging for the cartons and for the labels, and on it goes.
So all of this philosophy is right now, expressed in this wine, but presumably all these things that you've just mentioned, which are so good, is the idea that they will eventually extend through all of the wines that Villa Maria makes. Exactly.
So it becomes kind of like that learning step, I guess. We can be trialing new techniques, both in vineyards, in the winery, as far as decisions on the packaging go on one particular brand. And if we get to the point that we're sure that's going to be consistent enough to be used in all our other tiers of wines, then that methodology will be rolled out further. And certainly as technology helps catch up, we can be definitely looking at those tools. So
let's talk about the flavor of this wine, because it's very different, I think, than the private bin. And I'm imagining that its difference comes not solely from the fact that the grapes were grown organically, although that I'm sure makes and does have an impact on flavor. But how did you make this wine slightly, or why is its flavor slightly different?
Yeah, so definitely it starts from that vineyard perspective. So using those more alternative methods in the vineyard, we're definitely noticing that the grapes start to build up their own kind of resistance to pest and disease, which naturally means that the grape skins are just that little bit thicker. And so it's getting that extra kind of skin contact time of juice and skins. It's going to extract actually more flavor. So that becomes that big kind of instant kind of pop aromatically is right linked back to the fact that those grape skins are just kind of containing that little bit more extra kind of flavor. And then in the winery, it becomes just about really analysing, well, what are those choices that we're making as it goes through that kind of winemaking process. So I guess we're looking for perhaps choosing more neutral yeast choices that are just going to perhaps emphasize that land that the grapes were grown in. So perhaps choosing not to go for something hugely aromatic, but letting that wine be just perhaps a little bit more restrained. And then I guess we thought that with this particular EarthGarden brand, speaking about the land, speaking about that sustainability journey, then the next logical step was actually it's probably then going to be a wine that would be suited for plant-based diets. So it's going to be able to help tick that box for people looking for vegetarian and vegan. So there's those sort of choices being made in that final finishing step of the wine too.
So you're not using fining materials that would be animal-based fining materials.
Exactly, yeah. So those much more traditional products that have been used in the wine industry for hundreds of years, but often involved egg white for red wines and casein milk products for white wines. So it's just looking at what are those plant-based alternatives that do that final kind of phenolic palate fining step, but meet those vegetarian and vegan requirements. So.
Yes, we should say, by the way, that when casein or other protein coagulants are, or as Helen is saying, with red wines, egg whites are put into the wine, none of those actually remain in the wine. They precipitate out and the wine is drawn off them. But I think for people who are vegan, just the idea of that is not a comfortable idea. And so to have a wine like this, where no animal products are used, even if they don't appear in the end, no animal products are used at all, is perhaps a bit more comfortable. But for the rest of us, rest assured, there's no milk and no nothing else, no egg whites in any of these wines. Okay, before we go to your reserve, I want to ask about your use of stainless steel, because I think most of your wines are made in stainless steel, not in oak. And tell us why. Is it purity of aroma? What do you think stainless steel provides for a wine?
Yeah, and so it is a deliberate choice with the majority of the Sauvignon Blancs that we produce. For that exact reason, it's effectively providing that very neutral fermentation vessel. So then all of those aromatics and flavour profiles that are delivered in that Sauvignon Blanc are specifically from the grape variety and perhaps the yeast choices through the fermentation that we've chosen. And so and that is going to be the very main reason. I mean, the other one becomes that very, very closely monitored temperature control. So much of that flavour profile with Sauvignon Blanc is impacted by temperature. So as much as possible, we're choosing to harvest those grapes in the nighttime when the temperatures are cooler. So even that starts to protect the aromatics at that very first harvest step. Then once that juice has been pressed out into the stainless steel vessels, then we'll be very closely monitoring the temperature of that to be protecting those aromatics. And then all the way through that fermentation process, the cooling and that temperature control in that stainless steel vessel is very important for maintaining and enhancing aromatics. And so, yes, there's some amazing wine styles that are fermented in oak, but so much of that control of that process is just dictated by the ambient temperature. And whereas Sauvignon Blanc, it's all about aromatics, it's all about that flavour explosion. And so much of that process is actually quite controlled to make sure that flavour stays in the wine and those volatile aromas aren't lost through that fermentation process.
Yeah, so to put that very simply, would you say that the warmer a fermentation is with Sauvignon Blanc, the more you run the risk of very fine, beautiful aromas being just sort of blown off, literally fermented out of the wine?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, good. Keeping things cold. Well, you're in the good place to keep things cold. It's harder to do here in California. Let's go to your reserve, and let me hold up this reserve. This is the wine with the black label. Yep. And this is a 2021. And I tasted it earlier, and I thought it's not only the reserve, but it is somewhat more reserved. It's a wine that draws you into it. It's not quite that, I don't know, dramatic here I am-ness of the private bin. Tell us about what your goal is and how you made this wine.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this wine is aimed to represent that Wairau Valley. So that's our warmer sub-region here within Marlborough. And I guess that lovely kind of tropical lift, that sort of hint of passion fruit and guava, we want that to be there aromatically. We want that to kind of, I guess, draw you into wanting to taste that wine. But then we want the palate, as you mentioned, to be just that little bit more subtle. So we don't want it to be that big kind of, kick you in the face kind of acidity. We want that to be more subtle. We want the flavors to be richer and just more slowly kind of evolve for you. So I guess it's kind of much more of a kind of slower discovery of those flavors rather than a kind of the bang, here we are. And then the more the wine is tasted, the more subtleties you should be able to unfold. But we're also conscious that this needs to be a wine that perhaps will still keep delivering all of that flavour for a year or two to come, rather than moving on quickly to the next vintage. So it's just making sure that we've got enough kind of texture and structure in that wine to be able to last.
I love this idea of the wine moving slowly. I completely believe that one of the most compelling aspects of any wine is, I call it the wine's choreography, the way it moves on the palate. So I entirely understand what you're saying about it moving slowly. I'm wondering how you got it to move slowly.
Yeah, and there's so much of that, I think, comes in the art of how we blend the wine. So you're really kind of looking at what particular component is adding that little wee aromatic lift versus what are those components that are starting to build the texture and the layers into the wine. And then sort of having that understanding of, and how will that age. So just being kind of mindful of what it looks like now, how do we sort of see into the future, what is that going to look like, and how those flavours will sort of settle down over time. So just have to be, I guess, mindful that, your favourite wine on the blending bench might be the one that looks like the very ripe rock melon, but then you're sort of conscious that, okay, that wine might start to look quite soft over time. So how do we put something back into that mix that has that line and layer of acidity to kind of keep the wine bright and fresh?
Okay. Let me, we have an interesting question coming in. Let me see if I can read this from Aga. She says, do you try to capture in numbers how your sustainability strives to offset the miles produced, I'm not sure I understand this, due to New Zealand's, I see, perhaps the export miles due to New Zealand's isolated location. I'm looking for numbers, statistics, etc. I'm always frustrated when I hear food miles. I'm not sure what she means by that, without comparing them to the unsustainable wine produced. I think, Ago, we're going to have to get back to you on this because I'm not sure I understand all the ideas being expressed here. But let me ask you, Helen, a little bit about something that you mentioned right off the bat, which was New Zealand's sort of direction, how it is perceived in the world, and your, that is Villa Maria's, effort to continue to bring the story of New Zealand forward in ever more sophisticated ways. Where do you see New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc headed? How will we think of it 10 years from now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And look, I think it's ultimately it would depend on, well, where is the consumer at with their journey of New Zealand right now? How much do they actually know? And so in different parts of the world and even different states that I've visited around America, people are at a different part of that journey. So I guess that is why for us, the wine that we were tasting at the start, that private bin, we'd hope, that for most people is going to be the start of a journey. That's going to be sometimes the first experience they might have had from New Zealand or even with Sauvignon Blanc. And then we'll just keep exploring, well, what else is it that we can discover from the vineyards and from our sub-regions, even from other regions around New Zealand, and what other expressions of Sauvignon Blanc can we be delivering, and what is it that people are actually looking for. So certainly within a few different single vineyards that we are producing here, we're using those wines to tell quite specific stories about that particular site and that particular microclimate. And so certainly when the wine industry here in New Zealand was very young, that level of detail and that level of complexity that we're building into those wines perhaps just wouldn't have been understood. Whereas now, as the industry's maturing, people are starting to want to go down that journey of, well, what else kind of is there? So, and then I guess adding that next kind of layer on top of that, we'll start to push the boundaries beyond what everybody expects. So we're just kind of working on a little project in the background at the moment that throws all of the ideas we were just talking about with things fermenting in stainless steel out the window, and actually trialing to do a bit of fermentation in some neutral but oak barrels. So just to see, well, what will that deliver, and are people actually looking for that out in the marketplace too? So there's always something kind of new on the horizon, and that, I guess, is what makes kind of our industry sort of so exciting, is that there's so much more out there to learn and so much more out there that you can try and experiment with.
Yeah, sometimes everything old is new again, right? The number of amphora being used in wineries around the world is a pretty interesting idea. Well, right now in the States, as you know, it is we're right in the middle of spring, on the cusp of summer. And so wines like this that display a sense of purity and freshness just make absolute sense culinarily with what people are eating, and also with, I guess, how they feel. Spring, summer, it's getting warmer, and so this kind of cool freshness in the wine is really, really welcome. It couldn't be a better time for International Sauvignon Blanc Day to be occurring. So Helen, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really great to have you. I can't remember exactly the first time I had a Villa Maria wine, but I'm guessing it was sometime in the 90s, and I've enjoyed it many times since, but I've never had the opportunity to drink these wines with the winemakers. So I'm grateful for you to come on Taste with Karen Live today with me. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, everyone who have joined us. We are so happy that you did, and we'll see you next time.